To me, this is the true founding father of the United States of America, primarily because of his ideological conceptions and his influence, even though he was never truly a founder in the administrative, political, or military sense. And I usually don't see him listed as a founding father. This book will give you a great sense of the man, and I will provide some highlights that I think are relevant to you. So stay tuned. Welcome to biblioCultist, where I review books that I find interesting in the topics of religion, philosophy, history, and fiction. Please remember, subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, like the video, share the video, comment on the video. Doing these things improves the exposure of my channel, and if you just do that small little gesture, I would really appreciate it. Also, I will put my X account on the bottom where you can contact me directly, suggest books, and also my Ko-Fi account on the side where you can drop me a tip, and you can do it recurringly or you can do just a single one. And again, I really appreciate it. You can also check out the merch store in the same link. In this episode, I'm going over Thomas Paine by Craig Nelson, and this edition is from Viking 2006. You can find it hardcover, softcover, whichever one you want. Content is king. Keep that in mind and just find the best one. Now, when Thomas Paine arrived in the American colonies, the fire of the revolution was already on, for sure. But his short pamphlet, Common Sense, which spoke quite plainly to the common man, actually, that was the whole point of it, Enlightenment ideals. And usually this kind of work and pamphlet was directed at the intellectuals, but he did it differently, and that's what changed things. It became a bestseller, and for that reason inspired many into the ideological direction and focus that was needed for a nation being born, for a revolution. So even though his ideas were already around, they hit a nerve in the American continent for a different reason, primarily because the people that were forming in these 13 colonies were a lot more independent. It was a rural population primarily, and it was a lot easier for them to digest the notion that individuals in particular have unique rights that have to be protected from the collective. People that live isolated, they are self-sufficient, tend to feel more inclined towards accepting this kind of idea. And when you live in a big city or when you live in a more urban setting, these kind of concepts are less appealing because individualism itself is not highly regarded in those contexts. If you just say, I do what I want and I have my own way of doing things, in a community that tends to sound like a difficult person. But if you're living in the middle of nowhere in the woods with a few associated families that live at a distance, then yeah, I don't want any government telling me what to do. The American practical spirit also metastasized within many of these new ideas. And like I said, they hit differently in the old continent than they did in this new continent. Here's a quote. If Enlightenment ideas under the American Revolution became a social and commercial theory of living and success, for the French they became a religion, a guide to morality, and a campaign of the human spirit. Instead of deploying the Newtonian series of deductions Paine used to express his formulas for government and society, French journalists and politicians would become masters of visceral oratory, always striving to leave their public weeping or enraged. The apex of virtuous sensibility would, over the coming years, appear in the form of a citizen army of Parisians, dressed in rags, their eyes brimming with tears, demanding to be fed, while armed with pikes and axes. Now that is such a great quote because it exemplifies the actual scenario that is presented by the Enlightenment. It is a religion more than anything else, especially for Europeans, because there was a sense that the old religion was done with because it was hierarchical, it was oppressive in some way, It was superstitious, supposedly, because it didn't have the new science. So the Enlightenment was taken in a very serious direction, and they became fanatics of those ideals. And it became a cult to the point in which, during the French Revolution, they would literally replace statues of Mary and of Christ and would put statues belonging to reason, for example, and worship it. Now, you didn't see this phenomena in the New Continent, but you did see it during the French Revolution because the psychology was different. The people in the colonies were a lot more pragmatic in things, and they saw the ideals as being good political aspirations. But the reason this is interesting is because in the United States today, there is quite a few people that treat Enlightenment ideals in the same way. So what they call progressivism is just Enlightenment on crack. And they also become raving, aggressive fanatics of these ideals. And they want to enforce and impose egalitarianism with the power of the state, with violence if necessary. And this is not a new phenomenon. As you can see, it was the case in the French Revolution. So the description is quite relevant even to today. Now the question is then, what is truly revolutionary? Because to many of the founders, stability was key. Predictability is the elixir of commerce. But Paine's conceptual foundation is different. And here's Paine himself. Quote, every age and generation must be as free to act for itself in all cases as the age and generations which preceded it. The vanity and presumption of governing beyond the grave is the most ridiculous and insolent of all tyrannies. Man has no property in man, neither has any generation a property in the generations which are to follow. Every generation is and must be competent to all the purposes which its occasions require. It is the living and not the dead that are to be accommodated. Now think about the implications of this. It is taking the concept of individuality, it's applying it to a collective, because he's talking about generations, and then he's individualizing each generation as independent of the other, which is obviously false. And then arguing that each generation should do their own revolution. Now, Thomas Jefferson agreed with this and believed that the Constitution itself should be a living, breathing document that would modify itself to be democratic and therefore reflect the times. Now, of course, for men like Washington and Adams, the more conservative types, they felt that democracy was dangerous and ridiculous and it had to be controlled and directed because you needed stability. You needed at least one document that was treated like the Bible, that could be a foundation that wouldn't move so that you can build a country around it. For Thomas Paine, this would be tyrannical because if an older generation can cement the values and ideas of what is right and wrong from before, then you don't have really freedom to decide what is right and wrong later, because Enlightenment ideals are relativistic. And this is the reason Enlightenment ideals are problematic, because you can't really build a civilization that makes any sense with individualism being applied to collective, to groups, and then again arbitrarily switched, and then by the whims and desires of people that are being manipulated anyway by capital, for example, suddenly switch to a different direction. Now you have a new constitution. And you see this in Latin America, where you have countries changing their constitutions every decade, and it's always a mess. It doesn't allow stability. It's ironic too, because most countries in Latin America, they always make the claim that the US is stable. But what they're actually referencing is the fact that their constitution doesn't change. But then they move on and change their constitutions constantly. And they do it on the right, they do it on the left. It's fascinating. But how much of a right wing are you if you believe in a constitution instead of a holy book, for example? That's a different question for a different book. Now, of course, Paine, again, didn't invent any of these ideas. And I think reading this will give you a good summary, because it lays out exactly what I'm saying about God and man and stability when it comes to the conceptual framing of a collective effort, which is a country at the end of the day. Quote, beyond its worship of God-given human reason, the Enlightenment fostered a religion deism that combined Aristotle, Epicurus, Cicero, and Newton, and was widely embraced by such luminaries as Smith, Gibbon, Wollstonecraft, Franklin, Washington, Hancock, Jefferson, Madison, both Morrises, Hamilton, Montesquieu, Rousseau, Diderot, Lafayette, Robespierre, and Bonaparte. It was a faith with many fathers, the first being Lord Herbert of Cherbury, who argued that deism's key doctrines, the belief in a supreme being, the worship of that being through a life of virtue and goodness, the repenting of sin, and the hope for a benevolent afterlife, were the underpinnings of all worthy religions, and were so innate that they must have originated with the first thinking human creatures. Now keep in mind, of course, that this kind of religion is a generic religion. It's an Enlightenment manifestation in which you have all these values that are subjective and relativistic, but you still have people in the intellectual community that understand that you can't really run anything without some kind of source, without some kind of first principle. So generalizing the first principle into a single God that is generic, that anyone can understand, that applies to everything, is the easy solution to the problem. It is not dogmatic, it is not ideological, because the Enlightenment has basically taken over the whole thing. So all conceptions of ideas and what is true and what is false, what is wrong and what is right, is being managed already by the Enlightenment. But they want to put a God on top of it, and the deist God is perfect because he's vacuous. He doesn't have a personality, he is a concept. So that to me is the birth of the so-called right wing and left wing within Enlightenment. Because I've always said that if you look at the history of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, this is where you get the birth of right and left. But originally the right was simply monarchist and Catholic. So being right wing meant you were against the Enlightenment, against the revolution, you were against the removal of the church from the state. You were against secularism. You were against humanism. You were against democracy because it meant the value of majority rule, which means majority morality, which means switching and changing morality based on whims of the masses, versus the right-wing position, which is that true and false come from God, and true morality can only be defined by a single source, that kind of thing. But once the Enlightenment is absolute and it takes over an entire country like the United States, there's no true right wing in the United States. There can't be unless there is a monarchist party or a Catholic party or an Islamic fundamentalist party who believes in putting the Quran or putting the Bible and putting hierarchy back into the system, rejecting the Enlightenment. Since that's not going to happen in many of the modern republics, then the right wing morphs into something else, and it becomes conservative in certain senses. It will basically argue in pro-Enlightenment fashion, but trying to reduce the impact of the radical Enlightenment types by putting stops to power, by trying to limit government in some way, or if they don't limit government, giving government some kind of stability by saying, well, the executive power has a lot more power than you think. They're trying to manage the entire experience, but they're still part of the Enlightenment. They still believe the same things. This is where you see with deists. They're saying, okay, well, we believe also in democracy and the right to people to choose their religion, and we believe all that stuff, that's great, but let's say there's a God that says that. Let's put a God on top of it. That's basically an attempt to conserve something of the past. Now, whether that has worked, you can look into that yourself. But now, of course, that brings up the question, what was the religion of the founding of the United States of America? And if we're going to be honest, it wasn't Christianity. And this founder in particular, Thomas Paine, was clearly not a Christian. And I'm going to bring the proof by quoting Paine directly and then a short quote about him. I believe in one God and no more, and I hope for happiness beyond this life. I believe in the equality of man, and I believe that religious duties consist in doing justice, loving mercy, and endeavoring to make our fellow creatures happy. But, lest it should be supposed that I believe many other things in addition to these, I shall, in the progress of this work, declare the things I do not believe, and my reasons for not believing them. I do not believe in the creed professed by the Jewish church, by the Roman church, by the Greek church, by the Turkish church, by the Protestant church, nor by any church that I know of. My own mind is my own church. All national institutions of churches, whether Jewish, Christian, or Turkish, appear to me no other than human inventions set up to terrify and enslave mankind and monopolize power and profit. Every national church or religion has established itself by pretending some special mission from God communicated to certain individuals. The Jews have their Moses, the Christians their Jesus Christ, their apostles and saints, and the Turks their Mahomets, as if the way to God was not open to every man alike. Each of these churches accuses the other of unbelief, and for my own part, I disbelieve them all. So it can't be clearer than this. And I wanted to read the full quote because I think it's quite impactful. From any point of view, doesn't matter if you're a Protestant, an evangelical, those people that claim to be non-denominational, whatever the hell that means. Because the moment you say that, you are in a denomination. It's the one that says that they're non-denominational. I mean, no matter how you try to spin it, the moment you label something, you're in the label. But no matter which of these groups you go to, saying, I have my own religion and I have my own church and it's my own conscience and I do what I want and I don't believe in any of it, you can't claim that the most pivotal founding father, beyond Washington and many of these core ones, was some kind of Christian that is recognizable. Now, to go even further, I don't even believe the traditional, most famous founding fathers were Christians either. Not in the real sense. And here's another quote. John Adams was the most openly Christian of the first American presidents. He also was certain that without the restraint of civil law, Puritan fundamentalists would unreservedly whip and crop and pillory and roast, while privately noting that the Bible was full of, quote, whole cartloads of trumpery, end of quote. As a young man, he had chosen to become a lawyer instead of a clergyman because lawyers had a history of noble and gallant achievements, while ministers were tainted with the pretended sanctity of some absolute dunces, he would say. As president, Adams signed the 1797 Treaty of Peace and Friendship between the United States of America and the Bey and subjects of Tripoli, or Barbary, unanimously ratified by the Senate after negotiations by Paine's friend Joe Barlow, which included the statement, quote, as the government of the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, it is declared by the parties that no pretext arising from religious opinion shall ever produce an interruption of the harmony existing between the two countries. So again, I understand when people say the United States is founded on Christian principles. I get it. Because what they're trying to argue is that Western civilization itself has been impacted by Christianity in such a deep way that everything they do is Christian, conceptually speaking. But there's a problem with that because then you could argue that Satanism is Christian. And some actually do say it's reverse Christianity. So therefore, some people reject even Satanism saying it's too Christian. But it's also ridiculous to expand it so much. Just because there's a Christian undertone in Western civilization from the time of Constantine, it doesn't mean that the Enlightenment itself is Christian, that the values promoted there are Christian. They were not. They were meant to be anti-Christian. They were meant to be a return to paganism. And therefore, the United States itself is founded primarily on an attempt to abandon Christianity in one way or the other. Because that's what the Enlightenment is. And that's what the revolution was. Secular humanism is not Christian. And trying to paint it as if it is doesn't work. Now, of course, the French Revolution was the true hardcore manifestation and consequence of these ideas. And it scared many of its contemporaries in the US. Many saw the French Revolution as the consequence of taking the Enlightenment values too far. And of course, modern republics are corrupt engines of influence, degeneracy, exploitation. So yes, I can understand why someone in the American colonies could look at what was happening in the French Revolution and say, wait a minute, we didn't mean it this badly. I mean, after all, it was the French crown that helped the Americans in their fight for independence. It wasn't a bunch of radical revolutionaries. So you have this weird dichotomy. And I think this is the reason why the United States decided to be less friendly to other revolutions in their hemisphere, because they didn't want the Haitian experience, for example, the what was called San Domingo to happen in America. So they were very afraid of slave revolts suddenly. They became fearful of the consequences of people with pitchforks attacking government officials. So the psychology of the United States changed a little bit. And I think this is why the culture of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights became a new religion for the Americans. They started seeing these documents as if they were magical and trying to ascribe to them some kind of special power so that people wouldn't feel compelled to change them. So it's a hack. They're trying to step away from the consequences of their revolution. But even to this day, when I watch politicians, they are speaking like Enlightenment thinkers, and they advocate for all the same ideals. They just present them differently. One goes a little bit further in this direction, the other one the other, but it's difficult to step away from your very founding. So whether the United States is going to look the same in another 100 years, I doubt it. So anyway, hopefully you enjoyed this review. Please remember to subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, like the video, share the video, comment on the video. Thank you for being with me. See you next time.